artists seem to be attracted to Beijing for a number of reasons. One, the cost of living was there. They were inspired by the surroundings, and they were also able to get studios in former temples and other buildings that gave them lots of light and lots of room. Bertha Lum was an expert in stained glass windows who went to China, and she did very well selling pictures from stained glass and illustrations that represented China and scenes of Peking. And she was also chosen by the Catholic Church in China for this picture of the Madonna. And as you can see, this was the original, was in the Catholic Church in the Catholic Cathedral in Beijing. It was destroyed during the Cultural Revolution. And copies of it were sent to every Catholic church in China at the time, though not many seem to have survived. I haven't been able to actually get hold of one myself. But this picture of it survives, of her standing next to it. And she, like many of the female artists that came to Peking at that time, divorced her husband, came and started life again. Whether or not that's a good representation of the Madonna, you can obviously see it's got Asian influences into it, and whether, but it was the papal delegate at the time who chose it and liked it very much. Martha Sawyers is someone I think is very important as well, who came to Beijing and drew Beijing. She left just as the Japanese were invading and managed to get to Shanghai and on a boat back to America. And this was a seminal influence for her, having been in Peking, because she had seen the Japanese ruthlessly move from Manchuria down across northern China. And when she came back, working with United China Relief and the groups after sort of summer 1937 that were trying to help China in America, raise money, send medical supplies, and so on, she drew these pictures. And if you go online, you can see them, many more of them that she did. And of course, they were really almost the first pictures by Western artists of Chinese people that showed the Chinese as strong, as determined, as forceful, as resisting, not as passive. And that definitely struck a chord with the nationalist government, who liked her work very much, but also was very successful at raising money for United China Relief, and projected, I think, a very strong and positive image of China at this time compared to many of the other illustrations that had gone before. Isamu Noguchi, of course, the Japanese-American sculptor and artist, is another person who ends up in Peking by mistake in 1931. He was going from America to see his father, a Japanese artist, Yoni Noguchi, in Tokyo. His father got a little bit funny about him traveling using the name Noguchi and being interviewed by the press, because it wasn't aware, not everyone in Japan was aware that he had had a mixed race child with Leonie Gilmore, Isamu's American intellectual mother. So in frustration, he got off the train in Peking. He didn't know anyone. And he managed to meet a few people and move around in a network of art lovers, international network of art lovers, one of whom introduced him to Qi Baishi, the calligrapher and painter. And he studied with him for 6 months. And in the book, there's some illustrations that he did that I think reflect Noguchi's work very well. And if you're in New York and you go over to Queens, to the Noguchi Museum, there's a lot of the work that he did there in Beijing. And they've done a very good job at tracing what he learned from studying with Peking artists that later influenced his work, not just his drawing, but his sculpture as well. While he was there, he met Jean-Pierre Dubosc, who was a Frenchman who was a big collector of art and aesthete, who was collecting lots of art, largely because his wife, Jean Lu, was the daughter of one of China's major art dealers called Lu, who, if you've been to Paris and ever seen the famous pagoda in Paris, that is the Maison Lu, which was really the showroom and museum and home of the Lu family when they were in Paris. Very successful trading firm. They had another branch in New York, and Dubosc was collecting and sending things back to them. Another friend of Noguchi's was Nadine Hwang, who's another fascinating character who really deserves her own biography. She pops up in Acton's Peonies and Ponies. She was, she often strode around Beijing in the warlords, in the uniform of Zhang Shuiliang, the young marshal, who she advised as a sort of PR advisor to. She was an open lesbian. She had affairs in Paris with Dolly Wilde, Oscar's niece, with Natalie Barney, who ran a salon there. But she came back to, at the time in China, she would go backwards and forwards, and was a very quite well-known figure at the time. She went back to Paris and stayed a little bit too long and was rounded up by the Nazis, and is one of only 2 Chinese women to be sent to Ravensbrück camp, which she did survive, and eventually settled in South America, Montevideo. But an incredible life, and also someone who introduced Noguchi into this world of aesthetes and art dealers that was a much more, in a sense, mixed world between Chinese and foreigners than most of what we see in Shanghai. Helen Lamott, very quickly, was a nurse during the First World War in Europe, got very disgusted with what she'd seen, went to Asia, and there she discovered her cause of eradication of opium. But her partner in life was Emily Crane Chadbourne, who was a very wealthy American heiress of a plumbing fortune in Chicago. And while Helen Lamott was walking around investigating the opium trade and writing very excellent critiques of particularly the British and others being involved in the opium trade. I mean, this is after the First World War, so it's the sort of supposedly licensed opium trade. Chadbourne was walking around just using her vast wealth to buy up various objects, paintings, textiles, furniture, anything, and sending it all back, and eventually donating the vast majority of it to various museums and institutions in Chicago, which is one of the reasons why, if you go to Chicago, she's not the only reason. There's a whole history of why so much great Chinese art is in Chicago. But she is one of the major donors of that. And those 2 spent time really traveling the world, but did sojourn for quite a while there. And lastly, on the politics, I wanted to talk about a few people that don't get talked about a lot. This is Eugen and Helma Ott. I find them fascinating. Ott had been the Nazi ambassador to Japan. It had been a rather embarrassing time for him because Richard Sorge, the famous Soviet spy, had not only infiltrated Ott's inner circle and made a friend of him and fed him information, taken information from him for the Soviets, but had an affair with his wife as well. It was so embarrassing, the Nazis didn't know what to do. They moved him to Peking, then of course under Japanese control. And what I find interesting there is that the Otts become the center of this Axis community, with of course all the allies either having left or been sent to Weixian or one of the other internment camps. The foreign community during that time was really made up of Nazis, Nazi sympathizers, Italians, Vichy French, a few other odds and sods. There were a number of German men who had been traveling and caught up trying to get back to America, where they had American wives, and they got caught up. They became part of this social circuit, and various, of course, Chinese collaborators with the Japanese, and there became this kind of, Axis social set that worked during the war. And I think the operations of the Nazi Party were mainly in Shanghai, where obviously they were after the Jews in Hong Kong as well. But there was this set that had a social life that ran through and tried to influence the politics of occupation China. And so I think that's something that hasn't been written about. Barbara Hutton and the Prince Mdivani. Barbara Hutton, of course, the Woolworths heiress, one of the richest women in the world at the time and very young, married Prince Mdivani, who was a supposed Georgian prince, white Russian emigre family who married very well. They made a business of marrying very well. He married her. They came supposedly on their honeymoon to Peking. And it's very interesting. They came through Tokyo, then they went to Peking, they went down to Shanghai briefly, Hong Kong, and then went back. I think it's an interesting story because it's always been reported that it was a honeymoon, and they stopped in Peking for a while, and Barbara Hutton went out shopping with the Princess Derling, buying antiques. She had so much money. I mean, the antique dealers must have been absolutely delighted to see her walk in. They stayed at the Grand Hotel de Peking. What story that hasn't been told is that the reason they were on this tour for their honeymoon was that Mdivani, whose father had been a very senior figure in the Tsarist army in Georgia, was trying desperately to create some kind of unity among the white Russian emigres in China. Obviously, they had split in various directions, some of whom were supporting the Japanese in Manchuria because they believed that Japan could invade the Soviet Union and destroy communism and allow them to come back to their homeland. Others felt that there would be war with Germany and Japan, and so they should support Mother Russia, even if it was in the hands of Bolsheviks. And there were all sorts of others who had various theories about, obviously, they should create a homeland in part of Russia or other parts. And he tried to bring them all together to have one kind of voice. The Russian emigration was so divided that it was never able to be effective in any way, really. He failed completely, but it's interesting that this has always been told as a story of their honeymoon, but was really a story of him traveling to the major centers of the Russian emigration in China to meet with these various disparate groups. And lastly, Edgar and Helen Snow. Now, everyone knows Edgar Snow, Red Star Over China, and anyone who's ever heard me talk about things like this knows I'm not a fan of Edgar Snow, but I'm a great fan of Helen Foster Snow. I think she was the better writer, the better researcher, the more empathetic person in general, the smarter of the two. Here they are in Peking. They, of course, are often associated with Shanghai, but they went up to Peking. He taught journalism at Yenqing. She worked on her own writing, but also at Helen Burton's The Camel Bell, modeling or mannequin, as they say, wearing furs and silks that Helen was trying to sell to these malalo that came in from the cruise ships. And they would also meet up after work to go dancing on the roof of the Grand Hotel de Peking. The exchange rate was so good for the Americans. I mean, the exchange rate was good for all foreigners, but America being linked, the dollar being linked to silver at the time, the Americans were doing so much better than everyone else. So the Snows, part-time lecturer, part-time model, part-time journalists trying to write a book. I mean, we've all met lots of people like that. They were able to live in an enormous courtyard, funnily enough, on Kuijiaochang Hutong, Armor Factory Alley, about 50 meters up that Hutong from the Werner household, which of course is Pamela Werner and Edward Werner and the story of Midnight in Peking. And Helen and Edgar pop into that story as well as a side kind of theory. But the point about them was they are an example of the smallness of the community in Peking, and also how it crossed over, often so much more than it did in Shanghai. They had a Sunday afternoon salon that involved cocktails and nibbles, all in this beautiful Hutong that they had, and it's all very well described there. But they brought in so many different people, not just left-wing people that were in town, but Edgar would bring over his journalism students, some of whom were very famous. Xiao Chen, the author of Traveller Without a Map, a great book to read if you want to read a book about Chinese views on Europe, the only Chinese foreign correspondent in Europe during the war. He studied under Edgar Snow, but he also brought in people who had been on the Peking Man excavations. He brought in visiting journalists. Anna May Wong visited. He brought in they invited the aesthetes. They also invited some of the more interesting people from the legations. They invited people who had been in Peking at the time of the Boxer Rebellion to sort of talk about that. Right, to have people talk about what Peking was like 30, 35, 40 years ago. They brought in specialists on various areas of China, and then they just mingled it all. And that, to me, those salons, Helen Burton did a similar thing up in the temples of the Western Hills where people would go at the weekends. Harold Acton did a similar thing at his Hutong, inviting people who had a love of opera, art, poetry, translation, and so on to come to his place. This is something that we see a lot of in Peking, and it gives us, as people interested in China, so much work in terms of translations and studies. If you think of Acton alone and his studies of vernacular poetry, of opera, the translations that Desmond Parsons did of Chinese fairy tales. If you think, if you look at Edgar Snow and what he tells us about Yan'an and all of this that came out of this group and these salons that took place during that time. And I think that's why Peking is so interesting to me, and why after doing Destination Shanghai, I wanted to do Destination Peking.